All right, hi, I'm Isabella. I'm really excited to be talking about costume and fashion today and sharing that with you guys. So kind of an outline of my presentation is that we have a garment from a particular year from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era that's paired with a primary source document during that time to support my thesis, which is as we moved from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era, the clothing progressed in conjunction with the women's suffrage movement. All right, so analyzing the fashion of a given historical period highly contextualizes the political, religious, and class statuses at the time. For instance, in Europe, it was illegal for certain pieces of clothing to be worn for none other than the elite, and these are known as fashion laws. Studying, furthermore, creates an understanding of an individual's background, class, status, and sometimes religion. For years, the upper class was using excess layers of fabric and luxurious materials and trade goods to convey their status. With the increase in inventions to produce fabric and textiles, the popularity of fashion, not just functionality, was now available to the middle class. Overall, fashion has always been to convey an individual's status and wealth. The experience of fashion reflecting what is going on politically is not unique to Europe. While fashion laws stated previously are an example, in the United States, fashion changed drastically for women because of the rations due to World War I, and then again in the Second World War. Fashion changes with people and it reflects our society at a given time. Sorry, my slides are not. Hello. There we go. Okay, so the fashion and clothing for women from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era mirrors the political movement for women during this time. Moreover, the clothing that women wore was a direct reflection of where the movement's at was a given point in time. So as the movement progressed, so did the clothing. Nothing that women wore was accidental. Hat pins were used by single women traveling alone until they eventually became outlawed because there was so much crime involved with women defending themselves with the sharp ends of hat pins. And then eventually, as we get to the flapper era, women were bobbing their hair kind of as a form of protest. And these were well calculated and strategic moves to demonstrate where their feelings were laying politically. Women in the workforce during the 1800s became a key element to the political movement. Agnes Nestor was a glove worker in a factory enduring the same grueling conditions so many other Americans were experiencing during this time due to lack of regulation. So in Nestor's book, Working Her Fingers to the Bone, she details many of the realities of what work was like for her and the women at the factory. Aside from the 60-hour work week, the conditions of the factory were less than satisfactory. For starters, women had to buy oil and needles for their machines using money out of their own pocket, and they were not reimbursed. They were not allowed to meet and have lunch together because the owners of the factory didn't want them getting ideas to start striking. And they were charged rent for their sewing machines and the power that they used. Due to the growing unrest for laborers of all kinds in industrial cities in America, these women did eventually go on strike. However, because this was a factory of women doing women's work, sewing and making gloves, it holds a parallel to the women's movement, which was also gaining momentum. So this is the American afternoon dress from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's dated 1890. And it was a very typical dress for women to be wearing in America during this time. As you can see, there's very large, the shoulders are very large, which gives the illusion of a smaller waist. And the multiple layers, which included a corset, would have been worn under. And it can be, argued that this was seen as a more restrictive style. However, compared to years past, this was actually less fabric and did allow for more movement. This was a typical afternoon dress that a lady would have worn during the time. And it was still very modest because of the high neckline and the long sleeves and the full length skirt. So Agnes Nestor was striking at her glove factory as the women's political movement was taking shape as well. Women were striking at their job, fighting for the right to vote, and advocating for education. The American afternoon dress is a great example of the parallel between the shift in the women's view in politics and how it materialized in their clothing. So Frances Willard publicly shamed many articles of women's clothing and accessories in her book, A Wheel Within a Wheel, How I Learned to Ride a Bicycle. Willard argues that when women come of age, they are restricted with a skirt, corset, hairpins, and high heels. Of course, she's right. The clothing and accessories women were wearing were not for comfort or mobility purposes. They were to show wealth and domesticity, a quality husbands wanted in their wives during this time. But as Willard criticizes clothing and accessories, she parallels the introduction to young girls being introduced as being broken like a young colt. When Frances Willard learns to ride a bicycle, it is an act of pursuing independence, but it was also an act of protest. Protesting corsets, hoop skirts, and young girls forced into demurity. During this time as well, being a leader for the Women's Christian Temperance Unit, Willard was also making demands for women's citizenship, or the right to vote. In her book, she viewed the conquest of the bicycle as similar to the mastery that women needed to achieve over the wider world. So this is Mrs. Arnold's dinner dress. It's also from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's dated sometime between 1894 and 1896. So it's similar to the afternoon dress, but as the name suggests, this would have been saved for evening time, dinner time, something a little bit more formal. The two dresses share similarities such as the silhouette, large shoulders, and excess fabric around the hips to create a small waist. This dinner dress has far more complicated appliques, including lace. It features the same floor-length skirt, long sleeves, and high neckline for modesty, as Willard would have called it restrictive. It is a much more dramatic dress than the afternoon dress, not attuned to bicycle riding. At this point, the women's political movement, many women wanted to keep traditional values, but wanted citizenship. So this dinner dress, I really feel, is a reflection of that. It has many of the advantages of the new clothing women were wearing, like less layers, a smaller skirt, and those large shoulders. But unfortunately, it was not progressive enough to inhibit comfortable bicycle riding. However, this did not mean that women, such as Frances Willard, were not riding bicycles in garments such as this one. Plenty of women, including Willard, wore these types of dresses while doing so. Willard's background in the Women's Christian Temperance Unit, perhaps where her belief of keeping traditional women's values come from, but she remains a key progressive in fighting for the right to vote. Just like the dinner dress, Willard is an accumulation of taking on new and progressive practices while still displaying tradition. At the end of the 1800s is approaching the 1900s is beginning, the suffragette movement begins to grow stronger. In 1894, Carrie Chapman Catt gave a speech at the Iowa suffrage meeting. By this point, the suffragette movement was a very pragmatic approach and was being taken on by numerous suffragettes, including Chapman. In her speech, she criticizes the corruption taking place in industrial cities booming in America. Danger lies within male votes within the cities. The strategy that Chapman is utilizing in her speech is explaining the corruption of the political machines within these industrialized areas. By doing so, she's advocating for women to have the right to vote, to level the playing field and even the tide of the political spheres within the cities. However, even with this pragmatic approach, women will not get the full extent of their citizenship and earn the right to vote for another 26 years. The ribbon from the Metropolitan Museum of Art is dated 1890, 1920, meaning we don't have an exact date for this silk sash, but because of the growing strength of the suffragette movement between these years, it is appropriate this sash reads, "Vote for Women." Over the years of the suffrage movement, numerous strategies were employed to grant women full citizenship, including this pragmatic approach. But this sash in particular would have been worn during a march or a protest of some kind, the kind of march that women would have been arrested for, put in jail, and force-fed if they went on a hunger strike. This ribbon, which is so different from the dinner dress and the afternoon dress, holds so much power. It is a symbol of protest and celebration. In addition, wearing the ribbon across their chests, suffragettes would have worn white during their marches, as the colors were white, purple, and gray. While it could be argued that this sash is not a piece of clothing, I believe it's vital to include in this essay about the history of women's fashion, not just like corsets, hat pins, and boots. These sashes were worn by suffragettes marching all over the country, creating a national identity for women across America. So Florence Kelley, another suffragette who took a pragmatic approach the way that Chapman did, but she expressed different advantages for women gaining the right to vote. Kelly's speech at the National American Suffrage Association convention in 1898 focused strictly on how the right to vote affects wage-earning women. So at this time, many women were working in industrialized cities, mostly in the garment factories, but we're still seeing none of the protections and regulations that male workers working in factories were getting during this time. So the work that women were doing in the domestic sphere was undervalued, just as the work of women in the cities, in the factories were doing. Florence Kelly advocated that because women were, sorry, you threw me off. Florence Kelly advocated that because women were working as men in the factories too, they should have the right to vote. She expressed that having power at the polls meant having power in the workplace, which created safe working conditions and fair pay. The complete antithesis of the suffragettes' ribbon, which was this one, is the corset. It's made of whalebone and it's worn under almost every garment, and it causes irreversible organ damage for the women who were wearing them, because the more that you wear it, it squeezes your whole torso and it creates shifting of your organs inside your body. So this is also representative of their oppression. There are multiple American-made corsets in the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but they all share the same purpose: create a look of a small waist for women, restrict movement, and act as a tool of subjugation. Corsets would have been clipped in the front using metal clasps, and then they would have been laced from the back with the assistance of a chambermaid, as these corsets could not have been put on by a woman alone. The inability to put on a corset alone is another symbol of the corset taking away a woman's independence. There would have been numerous outer layers placed over the corset. The corset created a small waist and large breasts, the same emphasis that the dinner dress and the afternoon dress would have done. These corsets kept women dependent on other people, rejected movement, and made women desirable by creating the perfect figure. So the 1910s and the 1920s had women's fashion and hair trends changing drastically. Obviously, so too had the suffrage movement. The 19th Amendment passed in 1919 and ratified in 1920, which was almost 100 years after the 14th Amendment. Between the 1910s and the 1920s, the image of the new woman came into the limelight. The new woman smoked, drank, and was sexually liberated. The flapper was another term for this newfound woman who also had a significant change in style. Dresses were now above the knee, no corset, and no layers. Hair was bobbed and headbands were often worn. The makeup, the clothing, and the hair not only created a newfound independence for many young ladies, but so did the lifestyle that accompanied the flapper girl. Because the clothing no longer restricted movement, many women found themselves dancing through the night as jazz music gained popularity during this time. Mary Garden was one of the many young women who bobbed her hair, and she writes in her book that her reasoning was, because I wanted to. This idea that now in the 20th century, women could make these types of decisions simply because they wanted, we've come a long way since the corset. American designer Peggy Hoyt is featured at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the Costume Institute. The flapper was not only a style, but a way of living, and needed to wear clothes that inhibited this lifestyle. The short dress allowed for dancing and the ability for a woman to put on a dress without the assistance of anyone else. The dresses were short, but unlike the dresses in the late 1800s, they do not have the large hips and the large shoulders. The flapper dresses actually hid most of a woman's figure, and the goal was kind of to create this boyish figure due to its boxy shape. The dresses of the new woman of the 20th century was not simply a style choice, but a well-calculated decision. Like every other fashion trend in women's history, the length, shape, and weight of dresses differed completely from the dresses worn previously. It was no coincidence that the corset went out of style right as the right to vote was won after 100 years of fighting. While fashion alone cannot provide all details of a historical period, it is a key element contextualizing many aspects of life for a given period of time. When examining women's fashion history from the Gilded Age through the Progressive Era, the clothing women were wearing changed drastically over this time period in sync with the suffrage movement. Every fashion choice women were making was thought out and not accidental. Think of the end of the corset and the start of the flapper dress. Fashion history, it is an important part of studying various historical periods and should not be overlooked. It provides a perspective on how society is evolving. Thank you. Just for fun, this is 1928, and let's look back at the 1890s. So this is a pretty significant change that we're seeing, you know, with not only the straps and the length, but again, how it emphasizes the figure. Okay, thank you.
Awesome, thank you. So we'll have a 5-minute Q&A, questions, comments.
Oh,
Go ahead.
no, you go.
Okay, yeah, it's fascinating, and I'm so interested in what you were saying about like the political movements, the cultural movements. I'm trying to wrap my mind around too. Like I understand that, and I'm also wondering like what prominent figures are promoting like these changes also. Like, is that, do you find like certain people, or because you know we see these trends happening every throughout history, throughout world fashion trends. Did you find like it's also cultural, but there are also like prominent figures kind of moving progressive changes also? Like what?
So yes and no.
Okay.
Like I said, each of these dresses is paired with a primary source document. So this first dress is at the same time period of Agnes Nestor. And so she was a large advocate for women's rights working in factories, but that didn't necessarily mean that she was an advocate for getting rid of the corset. That wasn't really kind of like on the line of sight yet. And then again, like I mentioned during the dinner dress, we have like Florence Kelly and
Carrie Chapman.
Thank you, Carrie Chapman Catt. Like I said, like being part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they still wanted women to like uphold these traditional values. And part of that meant dressing like this. But at the same time, they were saying like, I can dress like this and I deserve the right to vote. If men have the full rights of citizenship, why didn't I? But that doesn't mean that they were advocating for dressing like a flapper girl just yet. And then when we get to the very end, this is a designer, Peggy Hoyt, who actually sold her work like in America during this time, which was really impressive. But again, like Mary Garden, she bobbed her hair. So she's one figure that it's like she's advocating for women's rights and like, bodily autonomy by wearing what you want and cutting your hair.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yes.
Didn't the when you're looking at this period right at the turn of the century, some of the younger suffragettes were coming into their own. Carrie Chapman Catt is like kind of the older generation.
Yes.
And didn't the younger suffragettes, the ones who were doing the marches and in the rain and picketing the White House, didn't they get rid of some of these big layers and everything to sort of, when they were protesting that they didn't want to look like the afternoon dress?
Yeah, definitely. So going back on this, like this dinner dress and this afternoon dress versus if you just Google like women's suffrage movement, this isn't really what you're going to see them wearing. Most of the time they're wearing something similar to this. They usually have longer sleeves, but they don't have as many layers. They also wear a lot of hats and nice boots so that when they're marching, it also is kind of like functional. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much.